The candle sputters in the royal bedchamber, casting long shadows across the face that once terrified Europe. Catherine de' Medici, queen, killer, survivor, lies prostrate on a mattress already soaked with black bile and fear. Outside the Louvre, dawn is breaking, yet inside this velvet tomb the stench is unbearable, the pain unspeakable, and the rumors are already flying. The witch queen is dying in ways too monstrous for courtiers to whisper aloud. What they cannot see is worse. Much worse. Beneath her nightgown, something moves. Not breathing, not heartbeat, but something else, a slow, deliberate pulsing that matches no rhythm of life. Her once keen eyes, now yellowed and bloodshot, stare at the canopy above where cherubs dance in gold thread. They mock her. Every carved face becomes someone she destroyed. The Huguenot mother clutching her poisoned child, the duke whose throat opened in her service, the daughter she traded for political alliance. The tumor between her breasts has split open. Through the linen, crimson spreads like a map of all the blood she spilled. A maggot, fat and white as pearl, pushes through the fabric. It falls to the sheets where it writhes, dying from the very poison that sustains it. Through the cracked window, January wind carries church bells from Saint-Germain-l'Auxerrois. 3 chimes. 4. 5. Each toll drags her closer to judgment. From the antechamber, muffled voices. Her physicians, those cowards in velvet, debate whether to cut deeper or let the rock consume her naturally. Someone mentions the Italian method, boiling oil poured into the cavity. Another suggests trepanation, drilling into her skull to release evil spirits. They speak Latin phrases they barely understand, their trembling hands betraying what their learned tongues conceal. They have no power here. Death is not coming for Catherine de' Medici. Death has already arrived, has unpacked its bags, has made itself comfortable in her bones. When the bells of Saint-Germain-des-Prés tolled at dusk on January 5, 1589, their bronze tongues spoke not of mourning but of relief. Throughout Paris, shutters slammed shut as if the city itself recoiled from the dying woman inside the royal palace. Catherine de' Medici, mother of kings, orchestrator of massacres, the black spider who had spun France in her web for 40 years, was finally rotting alive. The stench preceded her. Courtiers pressed scented pomanders to their faces while traversing the corridors of the Hôtel des Tournelles. Yet nothing could mask the sweet sick odor of gangrene blooming beneath silk sheets. Her right breast had turned the color of overripe plums, weeping yellow pus that soaked through layers of linen faster than servants could change them. Physicians whispered that the cancer had begun as a small lump years earlier, perhaps the size of a lentil, when she'd still worn mourning black for her murdered husband and poisoned son. Death had been circling her for months like a patient wolf. First came the abscesses that made walking agony, forcing her to be carried in a black-draped chair like some Gothic Madonna. Then her jaw locked, teeth grinding to powder as she dictated letters through clenched bone, still scheming, still plotting which Protestant throat should feel Italian steel. Her fingernails peeled away in perfect crescents, exposing raw nail beds that she pressed against rosary beads until they bled. In her final delirium, Catherine saw them all, the butchered Huguenots rising from Paris gutters, their slit throats gaping like second mouths. St. Bartholomew's victims dragged themselves toward her deathbed, trailing intestines across priceless Persian carpets. Children she'd ordered drowned in the Loire clawed at her bedsheets with translucent hands. They whispered in French and Italian both, voices overlapping like prayers and curses woven together. Her daughter Margot, once the most beautiful woman in Europe, now bloated from drink and debauchery, stood witness as Catherine's breath came in wet rattles. Each exhale bubbled through the fluid filling her lungs, sounding like words trying to escape. Perhaps they were apologies. More likely, they were instructions for which poison to use on which Bourbon prince after she was gone. The candles guttered as dawn approached. In those last gray hours, France's most feared woman became what she'd always been beneath the jewels and poison rings. Just another piece of meat, failing one organ at a time, powerless against the truest assassin of all. The stench of death had become Catherine de' Medici's constant companion long before her final hour. In the shadow-drenched chambers of Château de Blois, the once mighty Queen Mother lay wasting away among tapestries that had witnessed 3 decades of her machinations. Her flesh, once plump with Tuscan indulgence, now clung to bone like wet parchment. The blackened teeth that had smiled through poison plots now chattered uncontrollably, clicking against each other like dice in a gambler's final throw. Gangrene crept up her legs with the patience of a master assassin. Court physicians, those brave enough to approach the woman who dispatched enemies with toxic gloves and perfumed death, peeled back silk sheets to reveal skin mottled like overripe fruit. Purple-black patches spread across her thighs, each one marking territory the way armies once marked battlefields under her command. The smell permeated every corner of the royal apartments. Sweet corruption mixed with a medicinal stench of burning herbs meant to mask what couldn't be hidden. Her daughter Marguerite, the one child who'd survived Catherine's ruthless political calculus, pressed rosewater-soaked cloths against the dying woman's lips. Each breath emerged as a wet rattle, carrying fragments of lung tissue and 30 years of whispered conspiracies. The Queen Mother had ordered hundreds killed, Protestants slaughtered in their beds, nobles poisoned at banquets, lovers stabbed in dark gardens, all to protect the Valois dynasty she'd built from blood and silk. Now her own body staged a rebellion more brutal than any Huguenot uprising. In her delirium, Catherine spoke to shadows that gathered at the foot of her bed. She addressed invisible courtiers, some long dead by her command, hissing instructions about marriage alliances and assassination plots between screams that echoed off stone walls painted with scenes of hunting parties and mythological rapes. Her gnarled fingers clutched at air, grasping for power that had already slipped through them like the fine Italian powders she'd once used to eliminate rivals. The gangrene reached her torso on the 7th night, turning her belly the color of spoiled wine. Pockets of gas built beneath her skin, making her body crackle when moved. Catherine de' Medici, who'd orchestrated the massacre of St. Bartholomew's Eve with cool precision, now begged for death with the desperation of a peasant woman watching her children starve. Her final months unfolded like a slow-motion execution. By early 1589, Catherine's flesh had begun to liquefy from within. Court physicians whispered that her blood itself had turned against her, thick as melted tar and black where it trickled from her gums. She kept mirrors covered, terrified of the stranger staring back, cheeks hollowed into gullies, eyes sunk so deep they caught shadows like wells. Yet protocol demanded appearances. Wrapped in stiff crimson damask stiffened with gold wire, she was carried to council meetings on a litter, lungs rattling like dice in a gambler's cup, each breath a wager she was losing. Pain arrived in battalions. First the grinding in her joints, then the invisible knives twisting beneath the ribs, and finally a crawling sensation under the skin that made her claw at her own arms until fingernails snapped. She refused laudanum after dusk. Visions of her dead husband and butchered Huguenots marched across the ceiling, their mouths sewn shut yet still pleading. Instead she summoned her perfumer, demanding stronger and stranger scents, myrrh mixed with civet, crushed jasmine steeped in vinegar, anything to outstink the rot leaking from her pores. The Louvre, once her chessboard, became a sepulchre. Torches guttered in damp corridors, dripping wax like tears. Servants stole away silver candlesticks and fled, leaving doors ajar to echoing blackness. Rumor claimed the Valois line itself was cursed. Priests sprinkled holy water that hissed when it touched the floorboards. Catherine ordered her astrologer burned for predicting a queen devoured by her own womb. The irony gnawed at her harder than the disease. On the last night she could still speak, she summoned her surviving children, Charles long dead, Anjou bloated and useless, Margot defiant in morning black. She tried to press the royal signet into Henry's palm, but her fingers had swollen like spoiled sausages. The ring clattered away, rolling under the bed where no one dared retrieve it. Between spasms she rasped instructions for her entrails to be buried in a separate tomb, so the poison does not follow me whole into heaven. The courtiers exchanged glances. Even in extremis, she plotted fragmentation as strategy. By dawn, delirium had set the drapes on fire. Flames lit the velvet, casting her shrunken silhouette against the wall, an enormous, writhing which projected for all Paris to witness. The last sound she made was not a prayer or a curse, but a thin, metallic laugh, as if the iron key to her own damnation had finally turned inside her throat. Her lungs rattled like a rusted portcullis trying to close against an invading army. Catherine de' Medici lay in the black, draped bed she had ordered sewn from Spanish mourning velvet, the fabric so dense it drank every shard of candlelight and returned nothing. 40 years of poison rumors, 40 years of whispered midnight consultations with Ruggieri, the astrologer who drew her horoscope in goat's blood, now pressed down on her chest like a breastplate of iron. Each breath tasted of metal and rot, as though the arsenic she had so carefully measured for others had finally circled back to season her own tongue. Outside the Louvre, January rain needled the gutters and carried the stench of butchered offal through the corridors. Inside, the only sound was the wheeze of the dying Queen Mother and the soft clack of rosary beads flicked by her granddaughter Christine. The physicians had bled her until the basin looked like an abattoir, then burned juniper and sulfur to scare away the black vapors. Nothing worked. Catherine's eyes, once the color of wet ash and capable of freezing courtiers mid-bow, now rolled upward to watch invisible terrors crawl across the cracked ceiling. She tried to speak, to summon the rasping authority that had once ordered the St. Bartholomew's Day massacre with a nod, but her throat produced only a bubble of pink froth. Memories slashed across the darkness. The cold stone nursery in Florence where her parents died of syphilis, the iron perfume of the dagger that killed her husband Henry II in the joust, the tiny coffins of her 4 sons, Francis, Charles, Henry, Francis again, each lid closing like a chapter in a cursed book. Ghost children circled the bed now, barefoot, their faces flickering between infant innocence and the bloated gray of plague. They reached for her with fingers the temperature of cellar marble. A thunderclap shook the window. Catherine's back arched. The crucifix clenched in her fists snapped in two, the ivory corpus cutting her palm deeper than any assassin's blade. Blood dripped onto the sheets, mingling with the sweat that soaked her linen chemise transparent, revealing the withered breasts that had once suckled future kings. The court priest began the last rites, but Latin syllables crumbled in his mouth when Catherine's eyes fixed on something behind him, something the living could not see. Her final days unfolded, like a slow-motion nightmare. The once powerful Catherine, who had orchestrated massacres and manipulated kings, now lay helpless in a chamber reeking of camphor and death. Gangrene crept black tendrils up her legs while fever turned her dreams into bloody tableaux. She saw Diane de Poitiers floating in the Tuileries pond, her golden hair tangled with water lilies and intestines. The physicians' leeches gorged themselves on royal blood until they burst, fat purple bodies sliding across silk sheets like obscene grapes. In her delirium, she clawed at invisible assassins. The poison, it's in the communion wine. She rasped to terrified attendants who'd heard these accusations for weeks. They watched her tear at her own flesh, convinced Huguenot demons crawled beneath her skin. Her fingernails, once lacquered with Venetian ceruse, now caked with dried blood and strips of her own tissue. The stench of rot mingled with rosewater failed to mask death's perfume. October's chill seeped through stone walls as Catherine's breathing grew shallow. She demanded her astrologer, who predicted she'd die near water. When told the Chateau de Blois sat beside the Loire, she laughed, a sound like dry leaves scraping cobblestones, before convulsing in agony. Her daughter Margot, banished for years, appeared at the threshold. Mother and daughter locked eyes across 20 years of betrayal. Catherine's lips formed one word: forgive. Margot stepped back into darkness, leaving the unspoken answer hanging like incense in the death chamber. The Queen Mother's last coherent act was summoning her confessor. Between doses of poppy syrup, she confessed to crimes that made even the hardened priest blanch, ordering infants snatched from Protestant mothers, having her own son's lover dismembered, the secret torture chambers beneath the Louvre. Each revelation emerged as blackened blood from her mouth. God will judge what France could not, she choked out before her final hemorrhage painted the white sheets in arterial red. As dawn broke October 5, 1589, Catherine de' Medici died as she'd lived, surrounded by whispers, shadows, and the weight of uncountable sins. Her blackened tongue protruded slightly, as if tasting the brimstone that surely awaited. The woman who'd ruled France through 3 kings left this world naked, gangrenous, and utterly alone. Even death seemed reluctant to claim her, lingering 3 agonizing days before finally dragging her screaming soul into whatever inferno houses female Machiavellis. The Queen Mother's final moments arrived not with royal splendor, but with the stench of decay clinging to her bedsheets like a second skin. Catherine de' Medici, once the most feared woman in Europe, lay gasping in a chamber where shadows seemed to writhe across the walls, each one a specter of those she'd condemned. Her famous black gowns hung empty in the wardrobe, their heavy velvet now mocking symbols of the death she'd worn so proudly. 3 nights she'd spent thrashing against invisible demons, her throat raw from screams that never passed her lips. Court physicians pressed leeches to her temples, while burning sage failed to mask the putrid sweetness rising from her body, flesh already surrendering though her heart still beat. The tumor pressing against her spine had turned her legendary composure into something feral. She clawed at attendants who tried to ease her pain, fingernails caked with her own blood. On the 3rd dawn, when candlelight revealed her face had sunken until she resembled the wax effigy meant for her tomb, Catherine summoned her remaining children. They came reluctantly, these kings and queens she'd manipulated since birth, their eyes reflecting not grief but calculation. Even now, with death's fingers tightening around her throat, she tried to speak strategy, croaking warnings about Spanish plots, instructions for maintaining power. Her voice emerged as barely a whisper, yet carried the same venom that had poisoned countless rivals. The last coherent words anyone understood were simple, human ones. She asked for water. When it came, she couldn't swallow. Instead, the liquid trickled down her chin like tears she'd never shed in life. As darkness claimed the chamber, those keeping vigil swore they heard her arguing with unseen figures, perhaps the ghosts of her murdered enemies, perhaps her dead husband Henry, perhaps her own conscience finally demanding reckoning. At 59, Catherine de' Medici died as she'd lived, surrounded by beautiful things that couldn't save her, attended by people who hated her, clutching power that dissolved like smoke between her fingers. They wrapped her body in crimson silk, but nothing could hide the grotesque grin rigor mortis had carved across her face, transforming the Queen Mother into death's own ambassador. The woman who'd orchestrated massacres and manipulated kingdoms reduced to meat and bone, her final horror not in how she died, but in realizing all her schemes ended here, alone, rotting, utterly powerless. At 4:30, the candle drowned in its own wax, and Catherine de' Medici, once the shadow behind 3 French thrones, breathed her last sour breath. The black bile that had pooled beneath her ribs finally stopped churning. Her clawed fingers relaxed against the blood-stiffened sheets. In that instant the room felt colder than the January night outside, as though death itself exhaled through the keyhole. No priest had reached her bedside. God's forgiveness arrived too late for a woman who had bartered sacraments for assassins. The dwarf who sold her last warning was found at dawn floating face down in the sand, The Spanish coin melted into his palm like a brand. Her children, hearing the news from trembling servants, crossed themselves and retreated deeper into their palaces, already rehearsing their own ends. Henry would bleed out on a monk's knife within 8 months. Marguerite would rot in a tower. Francois cough his lungs into a Naples gutter. The Valois prophecy had kept its appointment, paid in full. Weeks later, when the embalmers lifted the corpse, the tumor split open with a wet sigh, releasing a stench that drove even the hardened surgeons retching into the courtyard. They sealed her in lead nonetheless, fastening the coffin with triple bands of iron, as if metal could imprison what marble could not. Yet during the funeral procession through Paris, the wax death mask slipped, revealing a grin too knowing for a corpse. The crowd, still haunted by the St. Bartholomew bells, scattered, convinced the witch queen was laughing at them from beyond the grave. Centuries have not softened that laughter. Historians still dig through charred letters and poison-stained ledgers, hoping to weigh her sins on cleaner scales. They forget that power rarely dies when the body does. Sometimes it lingers like smoke in velvet curtains, like mercury in the blood, like the aftertaste of a frozen orange that never reached a dying woman's tongue. Tonight, when the Louvre's corridors sigh with winter drafts, listen carefully. Somewhere a candle gutters, and a cracked mirror remembers the face that once commanded kingdoms to kneel.